Thank you so much for spending your lunch break with us and tuning into our first program of the fall, Acts of Rebellion and Envisioning a New Society, a conversation with Dr. Vincent Brown and Dr. Timothy McCarthy. If this is your first time tuning in to one of our virtual programs, I'd like to say welcome. And if you are a regular supporter of our work in the museum, I'd like to say welcome back. Before we begin the program, I'm just going to give a little bit of background about the museum. In the 18th century, the Royal House and Slave Quarters was home to the largest slaveholding family in Massachusetts and the enslaved people who made their lavish way of life possible. Today, the Royal House and Slave Quarters is a museum whose architecture, household items, archaeological artifacts, and programs bear witness to intertwined stories of wealth and bondage set against the backdrop of America's quest for independence. More importantly, our goal is also to situate the lives of the enslaved people who live at our site in a long history of freedom and resistance, and to connect the legacies of enslavement to the realities of today. And this event is very much so in alignment with thinking about how understanding the past and the realities of enslavement can help us think through not only our current moment, but also to imagine a better future. Helping us do that work today are two esteemed historians who will lead us in what will surely be an exciting and thought-provoking conversation. Vincent Brown is the Charles Warren Professor of American History and Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. He directs the History Design Studio and teaches courses in Atlantic History, African Diaspora Studies, and the History of Slavery in the Americas. Dr. Brown's latest book, Tacky's Revolt, The Story of an Atlantic Slave War, won the Phyllis Wheatley Book Award and is a finalist for the prestigious 2020 Kundal History Prize. His first book, The Reaper's Garden, Death and Power in the World of Atlantic Slavery, won the James A. Rowley Prize, the Merle Curti Award, and the Louis Gottschalk Prize. He is also the producer of Herskovitz at the Heart of Blackness, an audio-visual documentary broadcast on the PBS series Independent Lens, which won the John E. Connor Film Award and was chosen as the best documentary for the Hollywood Black Film Festival and the Martha's Vineyard African American Film Festival. So before we jump into our conversation today, I asked both Dr. Brown and Dr. McCarthy to reflect on how terms such as revolt, rebellion, and/or protest factor into their own work. What have these terms obscured and made visible about not only what one knows about Black history, but also how one can write Black history? So they'll begin with just their thoughts, and then we will move into a short conversation before we take some of your questions. Just a few logistics. We will have some time for questions at the end, and we would love if you would use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screens. Furthermore, we encourage you to use speaker view so that the speakers align with whoever's talking. So we're going to get started with Vince. Really looking forward to your comments, Vince, and you can take it away.
Let me unmute myself there. Thank you so much, Kyera. I really appreciate your introduction. And to all of you who've come to talk with us today here at the Royal House and Slave Quarters. It's especially nice to be doing something with the Royal House and Slave Quarters because this is one of those institutions that reminds us that the history of slavery is here in our landscape. You can visit it. It's not something that one only finds in history books. It's not something that one has to look too far to find. And it's especially gratifying to me, in part because Isaac Royall, who founded the property that the Royal House and Slave Quarters is built on, immigrated to Massachusetts from the island of Antigua in 1737, just after a major slave conspiracy in 1736, which included many people from the Gold Coast. And I have just finished a book on one of the largest revolts of Gold Coast Africans in the 18th century Atlantic world, which occurred in Jamaica in 1760 and 61. But this 1736 conspiracy anticipated it. And it shows us how, in fact, these actions by Black people, by enslaved Africans, their politics, compelled transformations in the world of colonial slavery, in the broader Atlantic world, that are sometimes obscured when we only focus on the Isaac Royalls of the world and not on the thing that Isaac Royall was responding to, was motivating him, which leads us to protest and rebellion. It's protest and rebellion, which often is the compelling force behind many of the driving actions which we identify as the forces for change in the world. So I went to graduate school in the early 1990s, where social history was in the ascendant, especially at Duke University, where I received my PhD. Now, social historians of that generation, the generation that trained me, often were responding to and reacting to an idea of history that located all of the agency, all of the action, all of the important work of historical transformation with great men of power, for the most part. And these social historians thought, well, maybe we should look at the social movements and the people who led those social movements, who actually compelled the great men of power to act, like this slave conspiracy in 1736 that compelled Isaac Royall to move to Massachusetts and found his property here. That is something I've continued throughout my career, both in my first book, The Reaper's Garden, which examines the history of Jamaican slavery hopefully from the perspective of the enslaved, but also in this book, Tacky's Revolt, which takes a revolt that's seldom known, even though it was the largest revolt in the 18th century British Empire of slavery, and tries to examine what the Africans wanted, what they intended, how they moved across the landscape, and how the planters responded to them, both in their counterinsurgency efforts, but also in the reaction to Black politics that in some ways created, or at least animated and secured some of the most enduring tropes about Black politics that we find among English speakers today, which is that one associates Black masculinity mostly with warfare and criminality and hypermasculinity. These are tropes that were engendered in some ways by the response to slave revolt and the response to this revolt, Tacky's Revolt in particular. So one could both examine protest as a way of thinking about how it is the world works and how it is that people we think are relatively powerless actually can have an impact on historical transformations. But we also have to look at the reaction, which is how those people who we traditionally identify as history's movers and shakers react to those people at the bottom and their politics. And those many of those reactions are still with us.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Vince. And I think one of the places I want to start is thinking about this work of doing, history, making history, and starting with people whose voices have not normally been included in the archive. And I'm wondering can you talk to us about how you did that work in Tacky's Revolt, given that, a lot of documents obviously will not have the voices of enslaved people who are leading insurrections. So how do you, shift that perspective to center enslaved people and their actions in terms of fighting for their own freedom and defining freedom in a bunch of different ways? How do you make that central to your story?
Yeah, well, thank you. I think that's a great question. And one of the problems we face with social history generally, but especially in the case of the history of the enslaved, is that the people who wrote about them and who left the records that we have today didn't care about their intentions, and they were in fact their enemies, especially when it came to their political activity. And so they wrote about the things that were concerning them. They wrote about their business enterprises. They wrote about their relationships with their creditors, with their political betters. They weren't necessarily concerned with ferreting out what the motivations of enslaved peoples were, and they didn't really care. So one of the ways you have to read those sources is to think about them really as artifacts of larger forces. And what I mean by that is you can't just read those sources as evidence for what happened. You can't just think that they were transparent reflections of what was going on. But you also can't assume that they only reflect the desires, fears, concerns of the slaveholders. You have to also assume that those desires, fears, and concerns are prompted, are motivated, are shaped by the actions of the enslaved. I often say, as surely as wind and water shape the contours of stone, right? Those are real forces which shape the things that you ultimately can see, which are things that you can ultimately touch. And so one has to use one's imagination to really think beyond what the sources say themselves to how those sources come to say that. And by looking at a number of sources in connection with each other and triangulating between them, I think one can make kind of very even if there's a degree of uncertainty, one can learn a lot more about the enslaved than those sources wanted to tell themselves. So one example for the way I did that in Tacky's revolt is I plotted all of the sources for the revolt that I had onto a map, and then animated that map so I could see what the direction of the movement and where the rebels went, but also where the counterinsurgent forces went. And by looking at the direction of and contours of the movement, I could determine some things about the intentions and the strategic designs of the rebels that those sources couldn't tell me on their own, right? So again, through that act of kind of creative triangulation, I was able to say something that I think is quite sound about how the rebellion proceeded across the landscape that I couldn't have learned just by reading the sources themselves.
That's fascinating. And I really am intrigued by thinking about slavery as perpetual warfare and using your sources to kind of reframe how we think about militarism and how we think about Black people as political actors. And I'm wondering if you can talk to us a bit more about the premise of thinking about slavery as this, perpetual state of war, and how, Black people were using their knowledge to actually shape the direction of these rebellions.
Oh, fantastic question. Thank you. Well, I'm not the first to do this. There are scholars who have recognized slave revolt, slave resistance as being something akin to a state of war. I think most especially of scholars like Ada Ferrer and scholars like Hilary Beckles, who in 1982 described a long history of slave revolt as a 200 years war. There are scholars like Vereen Shepherd who've done this as well. But the prevailing way for thinking about slave revolt is as thinking about resistance to the prerogatives of slaveholders, which it certainly was. But what happens when you think about slave revolt primarily as resistance is you just think it's resistance to the duly constituted authority of the slaveholder. And that locates it in that relationship between slaveholder and enslaved, or on a particular plantation, or even in a particular colony. When you think about slave revolt as war, then you have to sketch it across a broader canvas. Then it draws attention not only to just how the enslaved wanted to resist or reject the prerogatives of slaveholders, but also what their intentions were, what their designs were, what their strategies were, and their tactics were. Now, it turns out that this goes all the way back, not just to these Caribbean scholars who have taken this idea seriously, but to the enslaved themselves. So Olaudah Equiano, who went by the name Gustavus Vassa, who's one of the first major autobiographies who wrote one of the first major autobiographies of his time as a slave, and then his time in the British Royal Navy and his time as an abolitionist in late 18th century Britain, said that when you make people slaves, you compel them to live with you in a state of war. And he wasn't alone in this. There were many other enslaved people who, when they talked about their activities against the masters, they talked about warfare. And so this was a kind of warfare that wasn't, between great states and great powers with clear battle lines, with clear starts and finishes to the war. This was the kind of low-grade insurgency, that frankly we're more accustomed to thinking about today with the 21st century terror wars. And so thinking about slave revolt in that context as a kind of low-intensity, asymmetrical conflict that continued on generation after generation after generation, like the terror wars today, unfortunately, that really was the key to kind of opening up another way of thinking about slavery and slave revolt that you see in this book.
That's amazing. One of the other things that I really love about the book is that generally when we think about, slave revolts and even military history, it's often told through, the stories of great men, and one of the things that your book does is you question that a little bit by showing that, there are women all throughout, these revolts, their names are there. And I'm wondering if you can talk to us a bit more about that.
Yeah. So there's a convention for thinking about warfare that one could call masculinist. The idea is that warfare is primarily a masculine activity. And there's some justification for that. So a majority of the soldiers in wars have traditionally been men. But wars don't just affect men. And even masculinity itself is in some ways generated, right? The kind of gendered nature of masculinity is generated in relationship to women. And so that is a fundamental part of martial masculinity. As it turns out in Jamaican slave society, but also elsewhere, and I think across time, you find martial masculinity, the kind of gearing up of men to project their will in the world, often actually finding its manifestation in the force that men project against women. So kind of the gendered nature of warfare itself kind of incorporates women. And furthermore, right, when we look closely at these conflicts, we find that women are involved everywhere in them, even if they're not frontline soldiers. Kind of, we know that, again, sexual violence is a fundamental part of warfare. In these slave revolts, in slavery itself, as mastery, as slaveholders, like conceive themselves as masters by mastering the bodies of women, by projecting their will onto women. And moreover, when we look, we see that women are actually caught up in the fighting in various ways. There was one source that I found in my research, which was really illuminating. And that was to kind of go into it in a bit of detail. The whites were largely outnumbered in Jamaica in 1760. And so whenever the militia or some of the other forces that policed the rebellion would capture some rebels, they didn't really have enough numbers to leave guards with them. And so what would happen is they would place these people aboard Royal Navy warships, right? That would pull into the port. And Tacky's revolt began in the parish of St. Mary in April 1760. And after the very first battles of this revolt, the very first skirmishes, we find a group of 25 rebels having been captured and loaded aboard a Royal Navy warship. And then because they're entering the orbit of a big military bureaucracy, all of their names are listed on the ship's manifest. And as it turns out, a full 40%, 10 out of 25 of those names of the first 25 rebels captured in Tacky's revolt are identifiably women's names. Now, we don't know exactly what they were doing in the rebellion, but we know that if 40% of the first rebels captured are women, and we know that the percentage of the population, of the enslaved population in St. Mary Parish in 1760 was about 40%, that women are participating equally in that revolt at its earliest phases in some form. Now that causes us, I think compels us to rethink the way we typically tend to think of the masculine nature of the fighting and of warfare. And again, there are scholars who've been doing this work, particularly I think of Thavolia Glimpf, who's been thinking a lot about women's participation in the Civil War and has an excellent new book out called The Women's Fight, about women not just on the domestic front, but women as soldiers in Civil War. And the more we look, the more we find that women are kind of sprinkled as soldiers throughout military campaigns, and yet we keep reverting to this idea that warfare is the province of men. I think we need to add up a lot of these discoveries, stitch them together, and rethink our basic assumptions about warfare across time.
I love that. I also really love Thavolia Glimpf's work. And so I'm happy you brought that up.
Well, you have to. How can you not love Thavolia Glimpf's work?
It's amazing. And one of the things that I've always found so instructive about how she also talks is that, you know, about this work is that sometimes, you know, it's not about where we typically look for people. Sometimes we have to kind of adjust where we look for the individuals because, you know, it's not, the sources are going to be the sources, but it doesn't mean that those are the only places we can look. And sometimes they're just in different spaces. And I really like the way that she, you know, talks about how, you know, we have to talk about families in transit. And so thinking,
so I can give another plug there to Aisha Finch's work. Aisha Finch, Rethinking Slave Rebellion in Cuba, does some of that work as well, where she talks about slave conspiracies in early 19th century Cuba and says, well, let's not just look at the front lines, as you say. Let's look at what's happening in the domestic sphere so we can see how women's participation is, again, integral to these slave conspiracies and these revolts, even if they're not doing the frontline fighting. Yeah. But as Thavolia has shown us, often they are, even when we don't expect them to be.
Yeah, and it's always the unexpected that is also so exciting. And so I remember reading the book and getting to all these names, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like, these women are here, they're active participants. And this is just so important for how we think about women's involvement in slave rebellions, right?
Well, I think this goes back to your first question about the sources. And it is true that, these sources don't tell us in any simple way what we want to know about the past, and certainly not what we want to know about the enslaved. But reading them aggressively, interrogating them as aggressively as we can, doing the real work of kind of getting into as many archives as possible and comparing these sources and bringing them together, and again, situating them in their context, we can learn a lot more than we often think we can. I mean, I don't think one has to bemoan the absences in these sources as much as we sometimes do. Sometimes it just takes, as you say, a bit more creativity, a bit more questioning, a bit more kind of broad thought about what it is these sources can say, as opposed to just what they obviously say, that will open this world for us.
So one of the other things that I wanted to talk to you about was the role of success and failure in terms of revolts and rebellions. I think oftentimes we think of, failure as not instructive, but I think you make a really compelling argument that, there are many successes, but there are also some failures that happen as well. But what that brings about is that enslaved people are active agents in the end of slavery. And I'm wondering if you can talk to us a bit more about how you plotting all of the different revolts and rebellions, kind of what was your main takeaway about the way that people were able to organize and then make claims to freedom, and what were the different claims of freedom that people were making?
Yeah, okay. Well, that's great. So there are a couple of things in there. One of the first things is you kind of have to rethink the scope of the event that you're looking at. So while ostensibly the book is about Tacky's revolt from 1760 on into 1761, what I had to do in order to discover some of the things you're asking about was to really stretch that timeline. To say that Tacky's revolt isn't just this event that happens over the course of a year or 18 months in Jamaica, at this midpoint in the 18th century, but we have to look back to Africa, right? Stretching the canvas where these people are from, stretching the canvas on which they placed the revolt, and look all the way back into the 17th century, and look at how generation after generation learns something from the previous struggles that may culminate in Tacky's revolt, and pass on that knowledge to struggles after them. And I think the book really kind of ends with the Haitian Revolution, and it speculates that at least some of the participants not of Tacky's revolt itself, but people who knew about Tacky's revolt in late 18th century Jamaica ended up in late 18th century Saint-Domingue. Particularly, we know that Boutman was probably someone who was in Jamaica, and he was one of the leaders of the first big slave insurrection in Saint-Domingue in 1791. And what he knew of Tacky's revolt might have been instrumental in what he did in Saint-Domingue. So, but it's only when you kind of put, these particular events in the longer trajectory that you really discover that. Now, one of the things you learn as you ask about the nature of freedom struggles is that they are continuous. Even if one failure leads to another failure, which might result in success one day, people actually keep hope alive, right? So it's not just the kind of, one could think about this in terms of corporate sloganeering, right? Behind every success, there are 10 or 15 failures. That's true, but also behind every political transformation, there are people who've been struggling for generations to make that happen. And for the people at the bottom of society, despair is not an option, right? We can't give up. And that's one of the things that I find quite inspiring, actually, about looking deeply into the darkest heart of the slave experience in the Americas, is to find that even there, even at the extremes, people are still struggling. People are still trying to make a difference. People are still trying to improve their lives.
Yeah, that is very, very inspiring. And I think one of the ways that I mean, the book in general is just inspiring. And one of the ways
Thank you.
that, you know, really, really pushes the field is your method and methodology. I mean, you are, you know, spanning the Atlantic and making these major, major claims and interventions in a way that, you know, really puts at the center of this argument, like you said, Black people's desire to kind of impact their own worlds and to shape their own worlds. And I wanted to ask you another question before we jump into some of the questions from our audience members. I wanted to ask you kind of what was the impetus for the project in general. You started with Reaper's Garden, which I think, you know, if you haven't read it, everyone, you should. It's amazing. And you kind of talk about, you know, social death. And then we get to Tacky's Revolt. And it builds upon that story in different ways in terms of how do you situate and talk about Black political agents. And I'm wondering, did this project come out of the first book project? Did you start working on them at the same time? What led you to, you know, really focus on Jamaica as your main area of expertise?
Yeah, so I think the early focus on Jamaica, I mean, in some ways started from the fact that, you know, I learned a lot of the earliest lessons about the history of slavery in high school from reggae musicians from Jamaica. You know, the history of slavery wasn't something that was taught in any depth in Southern California public high schools where I grew up in the 1970s. You know, you might have learned that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, right? You know, you might have seen some images from Gone with the Wind, which by the way, today, Gone with the Wind, adjusted for inflation, is still the highest grossing film of all time.
That is wild.
Beating out James Cameron's Avatar and the Avenger films. So we got to deal with that, right? But it was through like reggae music, artists like, you know, of course, Bob Marley, but also Burning Spear and Steel Pulse, that I kind of learned that there was a story there, a rich story, a really interesting story, a story of struggle, a story of oppression for sure, but also a story of extreme kind of political creativity. And I don't mean that lightly. I mean, you know, as I was saying before, that, you know, when you look at human life at the extremes, that's when you see people really up against it and fighting back. And as it turns out, kind of as I learned more about Jamaica, Jamaica was the most profitable colony in the British Empire on the eve of the American Revolution, far and away the most profitable colony in the British Empire. The least profitable colony was Massachusetts. And even though we kind of think of, you know, the American Revolution kind of having its genesis in a colony like Massachusetts, we don't think of the British Empire that way once we really learn about its entire scope. So Jamaica became interesting to me for that reason, in part because I had learned some of the first lessons about the history of slavery, what I thought of as my history, even though it wasn't the history of the Southern United States, and my family is from Virginia. And also knowing how important Jamaica was in the larger colonial history. That really sparked my interest. And then, you know, frankly, I'll admit that it has a particularly turbulent history where the slaves always seem to be rebelling, and I like that. I was attracted to that. So I went to graduate school, you know, thinking I was going to study slave revolt. Wound up writing The Reaper's Garden first, which was really about how people contended with the demographic catastrophe that was Jamaica. It was a society that was so deadly that plantation owners decided that it was better to work people to death and import new workers from Africa through the transatlantic slave trade than it was to give them enough food and shelter to raise, you know, generation after generation locally. So it was a society in which death was the kind of primary experience. But as I was researching that book, I found a source that really intrigued me more about Tacky's Revolt. And it was a planter in the early 19th century that said he had imported some new Africans, right? Recently bought through the slave trade. And he learned that they had risen up and attempted to stab their driver. So he corralled these people, he apprehended them, he interrogated them, and he discovered through his interrogation that all of these brand new people to the island, right, these Africans, knew about Tacky's Revolt. and the slave revolts of the 1760s. That somehow people were teaching the history of that revolt from 40 years ago to brand new arrivals to the island, right? There was an oppositional political history being taught and learned on Jamaican plantations among the enslaved, right? This was something that was, quite striking to me, because people don't think about the popular education among the enslaved, right? We think that maybe their ideas have to come, from the planters somehow. Mm-hmm. This was a wholly different understanding of history that was derived locally. And so that really got me thinking much more in detail about Tacky's revolt, how it developed in the landscape, and how its memory was embedded in the landscape across the latter 18th century and into the early 19th century.
That's amazing. So I'm going to ask one last question, and then we're going to get into some of the questions from the audience. And when you mentioned, music, it made me think about how you kind of move between the arts and academia. Your work is very publicly engaged, and I wanted to ask a question about, how has the arts allowed you, how has it influenced your history and your scholarship? How has it made your work accessible? And also, what has it allowed you to imagine in a way that maybe a monograph can't encompass fully?
Well, I go back to what I was saying before, that like a lot of the earliest lessons on the history of slavery, especially in broader perspective than the history of antebellum slavery in the United States, first came to me through music. And if that didn't teach me a kind of detailed change over time, scholarly interpretation of the history of slavery, it gave me an affective relationship to the history of slavery that has remained continuous throughout my much more deeper and scholarly study of slavery. So I think that's one of the things that the arts can do. Dramatization in general is a great spur to memory. We tend to remember things that are dramatic, right? That have heightened emotion attached to them. So finding a way to embed my scholarly interpretations in more emotive and dramatic types of representation, types of presentations, is something that I think helps make the argument and make the argument stick. And that's important to me as well. So kind of thinking about how I can collaborate with people who know as a professional expertise the work of dramatization in the arts, and thinking about how one can really think together about dramatization and scholarly interpretation is something that I'm endlessly fascinated by.
This has been an amazing conversation, and I don't want to take up too much time asking all the questions, although I have more. So I'm gonna turn to a few questions from the different attendees. One of the questions is, I'm curious how the lessons learned were diffused across space over that time frame. How did later people learn about what worked and what didn't work?
Well, certainly word of mouth was the primary way. And what you find is that, enslaved people are moving around a lot because, in a colony like Jamaica, where 90% of the population was enslaved people do all the work, right? That means they do the work of transporting goods from plantation to plantation and from countryside to port and from port to countryside. They're sailing aboard Royal Navy warships. They're often kind of allied, sometimes allied with the planters, right, to suppress slave revolts because they can get freedom through those activities. So, and they talk to each other, most fundamentally, right? So the news about what's happening in the world is traveling as people are traveling. So I don't need pamphlets and publications to know that, right? Pamphlets and publications, of course, themselves are often just transcriptions of what people were saying and what people were talking about. So knowing how people are moving and assuming that they're bringing news from one place to another is one of the ways that I try to recreate this world of discourse. Now, I'm inspired in that by the work of one of my teachers, a man named Julius Scott, who wrote a fantastic book called The Common Wind about currents of Afro-American communication during the era of the Haitian Revolution. And one of the key really kind of routes of transmission was through sailors. And I also have lots of African sailors and lots of black sailors aboard Royal Navy warships and aboard merchant ships that are moving around the island and moving across the Atlantic carrying news. And that's one of the ways that people find out what's going on in other parts of the world, even if it's not perfect information. And as I show at the end, sometimes there's information that comes to them and they reinterpret it according to their own conventions and according to what makes sense to them. They make that less abstract. There's a case in which someone learns of the Haitian Revolution. And he says, yes, the Negroes are revolting. This is a black man. This is a slave who's saying this. The Negroes are revolting. They started in Saint-Domingue, and then they're going to go to St. Mary's, and then they're going to come to Westmoreland. Now, it turns out that Tacky's revolt had begun in the parish of St. Mary, and then had its major outbreak and uprising in Westmoreland. So what this person did is he heard news of the Haitian Revolution in Saint-Domingue, and he thought, oh, this is probably going to work as it has worked before. As we know from our oral history of politics on this island, it's going to start in Saint-Domingue, then move to St. Mary, and then come to Westmoreland. Right? That tells you something about the way they conceive the political science of Jamaican slavery that I think one couldn't learn if you didn't think more broadly about how these people learn from others in moving around this Atlantic world.
Okay, so we have another question, which is, I'm curious to know if viewing slavery and revolts as part of a long war also challenges us to think differently about historical trauma. Is there a way that historical trauma as a concept has also centered on the power of the oppressors as opposed to the desires of the enslaved? Yeah,
so it's a great question, not one that I can do a lot with my sources. And in part, that's because the literature on trauma is so focused generally on the individual and what crisis does, what a horrible situation does to the psyche of the individual. Because I don't have sources, for the most part, produced by those individuals that I'm concerned with, I'm very wary and very hesitant about making generalizations about traumatized people, right? I think one could assume that trauma is a major factor. And I think there's, my colleague Stephanie Smallwood at University of Washington has done fantastic work in thinking about the trauma of the slave trade on the way enslaved peoples at the time spoke to each other and talked about their experience or didn't talk about their experience. But beyond that, I don't know that there's a whole lot that I feel comfortable saying, in part because ultimately, while I advocate for very innovative readings of sources, I have some conservative streaks in my methodology, which is that I don't think that I can impute to sources things that I can't plausibly say that are happening there. So to take a kind of literature on trauma that is mostly from the late 20th and 21st century and project that back into the 18th century, I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm saying that kind of is beyond the scope of my own methodological inclinations.
Okay, so I'm going to just keep the questions going. So we have another question from one of our attendees, which is, have any stories of slave rebellions been passed down in family history to people living today?
Yeah, I mean, you can look at the Works Projects Administration narratives that were collected in the 1930s from formerly enslaved Black people who were largely children when they were enslaved but had memories. And you find that there are memories of Nat Turners Revolt in the early 1830s that were handed down to people in the 1930s. There's a woman, I can't remember her name right now, who's doing a fantastic study of Southampton, Virginia, and the Nat Turner Revolt and the kind of memory of Nat Turner's Revolt in Southampton, Virginia. And I'm drawing a blank on the name, but kind of look for that. I think that would be important to discover. And then speaking specifically about Tacky's Revolt in Jamaica, there was a kind of long folk memory of Tacky's Revolt that people in St. Mary used to talk about. So, unbeknownst to me until very recently, there is an artist and activist named Derek Black X Robinson in Jamaica, who has been promoting the history of Tacky's Revolt and campaigning for Tacky to be named a national hero, one of kind of Jamaica's small pantheon of national heroes in Jamaica. Around the same time that I started researching Tacky's Revolt, Black X was actually learning from the folk in St. Mary, their understanding of Tacky's revolt and what had played out across the landscape. And particularly there was a place called Tacky Falls, where they said that Tacky used to hide out in a cave from the British forces during his portion of the revolt. And those people actually kind of convinced Black X that this history was something important that needed to be promoted. And for the last 15 years or so, he's been walking across Jamaica wearing a chain. And I can't remember exactly how heavy this chain is, but I think it's more than 50 pounds. A chain around his neck, walking across Jamaica to dramatize, but also to raise awareness of Tacky's revolt. We recently connected when the book came out, and I learned about his efforts. So there you can see that this folk history is conveyed through different means than scholarly history. And it's just gratifying to me to see that, you know, Black X was doing his work on the same revolt, and I was doing my work in another realm on the same revolt. And now in some ways we're connected, and I think our work informs each other. The folk memory of slavery will not be the same as the scholarly history of slavery, but I think that they can amplify an understanding of these long past events by being understood together.
Okay, so what role, if any, did religion play in Tacky's revolt?
Oh, a huge role. So one of the, speaking specifically about the kind of military role that religion played, is that diviners, obeamen, who were supernatural adepts, were responsible for administering loyalty oaths among the combatants, and casting spells that would confer protection on them, which helped to boost their morale. So both in boosting morale and in securing the loyalty of the troops, these religious practitioners were crucially important. And in fact, when they were captured or killed, that did help to demoralize the rebels to an extent that at least the planters thought it made them easier to fight. Now, let's not just think of this as something that happens among the Africans or the Black people. Before British troops went into battle, one of the things that would always be read to them before every engagement was the Articles of War governing His Majesty's military services. And the very beginning of the Articles of War is a loyalty oath to the Anglican Church. So you can see that British forces are also spending their time trying to kind of cement the loyalty of their troops and confer supernatural protection on them through the reading of the Articles of War. So, and I think that, you know, that does not stop in the 18th century. That supernatural protection, supernatural kind of morale and organization is still crucial to the way wars are fought across the world today.
Okay, great. Someone wants to know what role, if any, did children play in the different revolts and rebellions?
Yeah, so hard to tell from the sources I have, and I didn't break them out in terms of thinking specifically about the role of children, so I can't give you a very good answer. But you know, swept up quite often. We know that that in the Westmoreland portion of the revolt, where the rebels went to try and build their own Maroon society in the mountains of Westmoreland, in the Hanover Mountains, they took many children with them, right? Hoping to build an alternative society with youth. So it wasn't just a military camp. The idea was to build a kind of independent or semi-autonomous society. And so children were crucial there. Other than that, I hesitate to say.
Okay. So do you think the contemporary resurgence of Maroon identity in culture, as well as indigenous cultures across the Caribbean, are a parallel example of how cultures of resistance are kept alive, storied, and passed down to keep political movements going? What can we learn from the history you tell about the potential contours of such movements now? How is the common wind transmitted today?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's a great question. I mean, I'm not a scholar of present day social movements, so anything I can tell you would be speculative. But I mean, what I can observe as a citizen subject, kind of what I see is that people still have alternative histories, alternative visions of what's possible in the future based on what they know of the past that may not be official history. And that to me is the key distinction. There are all kinds of, historical understandings that are not the official history, that inform the way people think about what their activism can do in the present moment and what kind of society they're hoping to build. What I'm hoping is that Tacky's Revolt can offer something to that canon. Even though it's a scholarly study, I still think that it's a study that teaches us that these kinds of alternative histories are viable, are real. They're not merely fantasy. That they can actually be subject to scholarly scrutiny and critique. We can understand them on their own terms and not simply assume that these things are fantasy, right? That their memory as distinct from history. One can think about the relationship between memory and history by studying these past revolts in a scholarly way, even if they're not the same as the kind of memories that inform our activism in the present.
Okay, so another question. In your research, did you find evidence of white European women of the enslaver class perpetuating the brutal suppression of revolts in Jamaica or elsewhere in the Atlantic world?
Yeah, so you don't have as many kind of independent women slaveholders in colonial Jamaica as you have, say, in the United States in the antebellum period. Kind of what you have are, listen, so anytime there was a revolt, one of the things that they would do is they'd bring a bunch of Royal Navy warships around to the port near the town, and people would evacuate the plantations, women, children, the elderly would evacuate the plantations, huddle in town, and then often board these Royal Navy warships. And then what would happen is the fighting age males, especially in the militia, but also then in the British Army and the Royal Navy and Marines, would wind up pursuing the rebels in the countryside. So they would kind of clear these territories, and then they would make them a free fire zone between combatants. And so you didn't have, at least in the research that I've done, many white women slaveholders actively engaged in the suppression of the revolt in that way.
So we have another question, which is, in your research, did you find any reference to participation in these revolts by indigenous people of New England who were sent to or sold to Jamaica?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There was a small but active slave trade from the southeastern United States to the Caribbean. There's a scholar named Linford Fisher at Brown University who is doing some intense research on that right now, mostly in the 17th century, but on into the 18th century as well. The population of enslaved Native Americans was extremely small, though, in Jamaica. But so you don't find that they had their own polities as they do in the colonial North America and in the United States. You find them kind of scattered around, kind of mostly appearing as individuals. Though there was, in one source that I found, a report that some of the rebels had been informed on by an enslaved Indian. And I couldn't really say more than that just appeared. You also find that enslaved peoples, whether African or Black or Indian, are mentioned in the slave laws as targets of suppression in the wake of the revolt. Again, I don't have sources that tell me much about what they do independently, except for that one about the informant. But we do find them turning up in these laws as subjects of regulation. So we know they were there. But I'm also looking forward to Linford Fisher's work to tell us much more, in much more detail, about enslaved Native Americans in the Caribbean.
So Vince, do we have time for about 2 more questions?
Yeah, we can take 1 or 2.
Okay. So one of the questions is, what lessons do you think we can learn from the history of slavery and slave revolts as we attempt to not only reckon with our current moment, but also fight against the rise of white supremacy today?
Yeah. So the way I like to think about that is sometimes you'll hear talk that, kind of reduce the problems we have in the present to slavery, right? And I tend to think that there are kind of more proximate and immediate causes that we have to contend with, and there are more underlying kind of continuous long-term problems that we have to deal with. Certainly the stigma attached to African heritage, right, is something that is a legacy of slavery, right? The anti-Black racism that we see that's kind of, enduring is itself a legacy of slavery, right? But how that takes form in a society and how we have to contend with that changes over time and often changes pretty dramatically. So one of the problems that we're facing most directly today is the problem of police violence. And that's not just a problem of racism. That's a problem of the militarism of American society, right? I mean, I think, I read recently somewhere that the police in Norway haven't killed anybody in 10 years. And police in the US kill like 1,000 people a year by gunfire, right? And not only Black people, disproportionately Black people, partly or mostly because of that anti-Black racism and the associations between Black people and criminals. But also, I mean, the police just shot this like 13-year-old autistic kid in Utah just the other day, right? And it's because we have a militaristic society in which small arms completely suffuse the civil society. And so police themselves are on hair trigger because they constantly feel that their lives are being threatened in any situation. And then if they read, the stigma of Black skin on a body, then they think they're in more danger and they're more likely to shoot much more quickly, right? And we have a society in which it's so violent that that is somehow acceptable to the general population, right? So racism is a fundamental part of that, but it's not just racism. There are more proximate causes. And one of the other ones is, Supreme Court rulings, I think in particular, Graham versus Connor, maybe in 1989 or so, which basically allow the police to argue that if they feel threatened, then they can use any force necessary to neutralize the threat, right? So you have found kind of police abuse and police violence increasing pretty dramatically in the wake of those decisions because police are they have basically impunity. And so any of their actions can be justified by the feeling of being in danger. And these are kind of rules of engagement that don't even obtain for soldiers in warfare, right? The rules of engagement for soldiers at war are stricter in some ways than the rules of engagement for police in our domestic society. That's a much larger problem that we all face that is associated with the problem with racism. Racism is folded into that, but is not reducible to the problem of racism, and therefore certainly not reducible to the legacy of slavery.
Wow, well, I think we should end there because that was just amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Brown, for giving us some of your time today. If you have not read Tacky's Revolt, please go to your local bookstore and grab a copy. It is going to blow your mind. It is just powerful.
Thank you.
I want to say thank you again to the Charles Warren Center and the Carr Center for co-sponsoring this event. I want to give a shout out in particular to Dr. Taya Miles, who supported this event. I also would like to say thank you to every single one of you for showing up and asking such engaging questions. This is really, really great. And I just want to let you know that you can follow the Royall House and the Royall House and Slave Quarters on social media. Our website is royallhouse.org. On Twitter, we're at Royall House. On Instagram, we're at Royall House 1737. And on Facebook, we're at Royall House Slave Quarters. Please, give us a follow and support so that you can see more programs like this. And thank you again, Vince. This was just amazing. I really
thank you so much. Thank you, Kyera, and thanks everyone for coming. I really appreciate you staying and listening, and I hope you do enjoy Tacky's Revolt if you get around to reading it.
Okay, well, we're gonna let you go and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye, everyone. Thank you for tuning in.